Number 12 on this test, on this review is suppose a tire producer runs a quality test to find convincing evidence of faulty tires. So he's trying to find evidence of faulty tires. And he starts with the null hypothesis that the tires are not faulty. He's trying to prove that they are faulty. So his p-value is 0.012 with an alpha 0.05, which means he had convincing evidence because the p-value is lower. And suppose the tires are actually okay and not faulty at all. So he proved that the tires are actually faulty, but they're not. So what type of error did they make, and what might the consequences be? So let's talk about type 1 and type 2 errors here. You're going to want to write these notes in a spot where you have room on your review. So a type 1 error means you rejected the null, which means you proved what you were trying to prove. You found convincing evidence to prove what you were trying to prove, but you were wrong. And a good example of that is the court cases we used throughout the year, where you found evidence to find the defendant guilty, but he wasn't guilty. So in this situation, that would mean you found evidence that the tires were faulty, but they're not. And this is what happened here. So this is a type 1 error. This is a type 1 error here. Because we found convincing evidence for the tires being faulty, but they weren't. So this is called a type 1 error, when you find convincing evidence of something but you were wrong. And let me give you a couple more examples of this. You might want to pause this and write this down, but I'm going to go through it and talk about it now. So yeah, you found convincing evidence but you were wrong. This is also called a false positive, which means you tested positive for COVID, but the test is wrong, you don't actually have COVID. That would be another good example of a type 1 error. So type 1 error means you proved it. You rejected the null, but the null was actually the right thing. So we rejected that the tires were okay, but they were actually okay. So it's like 3 different ways of thinking about the same thing here. And then you've got a type 2 error, which is the opposite of this. This means you failed to reject it. You failed to prove anything. And you should have, because the HO was actually false. So you failed to find convincing evidence to prove your HA, but you were wrong. Like in the court case thing, that would mean you failed to find evidence the defendant was guilty, but he was guilty. So you're letting a guilty man go free. In type 1, we were letting an innocent man go to prison. So in type 2, we're letting a guilty man go free. So this is also known as a false negative, this type 2 error. This would be like testing negative for COVID. We failed to find that you have COVID, but you actually do have COVID. So that's a type 2 error. So take the time to pause and write this down on your sheet, because it's going to be very helpful on the final. Once you're done, we'll go back to this. And so this is a type 1 error. We found convincing evidence for the tires being faulty, but they weren't. So the likely consequence would be that they take the tires off the market. They'll probably stop selling them when they didn't need to. And they would lose some profits. They would definitely lose some money, because they would probably take these tires off the market when they didn't need to, and they would lose some profits. Now, I would argue in this situation, a type 2 would have been worse, though. Because they lose a little bit of money on tires. What if the type 2 would have happened, and they would have failed to find evidence that the tires are faulty, but they are? That would mean they keep selling the tires, even though they're faulty, and that would lead to mad customers, and that's way worse for a company long term, because it hurts the reputation of the company. It hurts their reputation, and people see them as having tires that they cannot rely on, and they're faulty. So a type 2 would have been worse here. A type 1 was not that bad of an error to make. As a matter of fact, they set up their tests to have a type 1 happen more often than a type 2 because this is less bad for the company. They'll lose a little bit of money. They'll throw away the tires when they shouldn't, but they'll survive that. That's way better than having customers not believe in your product. So yeah, my final answer would be a type 1 error on this problem.